The gun was already pressed against Letitia Monroe's temple when she said the words that changed everything. "Every single one of them made me promises," she said, her voice low and shaking, though not with fear, with fury. "Every man in this town stood on my porch and told me what my life would look like, told me they would protect me, told me they would save my land, told me they would love me right and true and forever." She looked past the barrel, past the hand gripping it, past the man who held the weapon with trembling resolve, and she fixed her gaze on the lean, quiet stranger standing 30 feet away in the center of the dusty street. And then there was him. The man holding the gun, Cledis Vane, red-faced and sweating through his collar despite the October chill, jabbed the barrel harder against her skin. "You shut your mouth, Letitia. You shut it right now. I gave you everything a woman in your position could ask for. You gave me words," she said. "Just more words." Timothy Hudson had not moved. He stood with his thumbs hooked in the front pockets of his worn canvas trousers, his dark brown duster hanging open, his hat casting a thin shadow over his eyes. He did not reach for the Colt at his hip. He did not spread his stance into a fighter's posture. He simply watched, and that stillness was more terrifying than any man who ever drew iron in this town had ever managed to be. "Let her go, Vane," he said. His voice was not loud. It carried anyway, the way a stone carries when it falls into still water. "And why would I do that?" Cledis barked. "What are you going to do, Drifter? You have been in this town 3 weeks. You have no stake here. You have no land. You have nothing." "That is true," Timothy said. He took one slow step forward. Then another. "I have nothing, which means I have nothing to lose." Cledis's hand was shaking worse now. The hammer was back. The afternoon sun was slanting hard and orange across the main street of Caldwell's Crossing, New Mexico territory in the autumn of 1882, and somewhere behind the gathered crowd, a woman was crying quietly and a horse was stamping its feet in a nervous rhythm against the packed dirt. "I made her a promise," Timothy said, taking another step, then another. "Just one, and I intend to keep it." The silence that followed those 9 words was the loudest thing Letitia Monroe had ever heard in her 26 years of living. She had not always lived in a town where men made promises they could not keep. She had not always lived in fear of the very protection she had been offered. But that is a story that began long before Cledis Vane pressed a gun to her head, and it begins the way most tragedies do, with something that looked very much like hope. Letitia came to Caldwell's Crossing in the spring of 1878, when she was 22 years old and freshly widowed from a marriage that had lasted 14 months before the cholera took her husband, a gentle carpenter named Robert Monroe, in the muddy lowlands outside of St. Louis. She had no family left to speak of. Her father had died in the war. Her mother had followed a year later from grief and influenza, and she had exactly $47, a wagon, 2 mules, a trunk of practical clothes, a leather-bound journal she wrote in every night, and a deed to 160 acres of New Mexico territory land that Robert had filed for under the Homestead Act before he died. He had made her a promise too, she supposed. He had promised her a life out west, sun and red dirt, and the clean kind of freedom that you could not find in a city crowded with smoke and the memory of the war. He had promised her a house with a porch where she could watch the sunsets, and he had promised her children with his hazel eyes. He had died before any of it could come true, and she had come to New Mexico territory alone and done her best to make good on the dream herself. The land was beautiful and brutal in equal measure. The acres sat against the low eastern foothills of the Black Range, red clay soil cutting through patches of grama grass and pinyon pine, with a creek running clear along the southern edge that never fully dried up even in July. The house she built with the help of her nearest neighbor, an older Tejano man named Augusto Reyes, who asked for nothing in return and taught her how to read the weather in the color of the morning sky, was small but solid, 2 rooms with a proper iron stove, and a plank floor she sanded smooth herself. Within 6 months of her arrival, the town of Caldwell's Crossing had taken notice of Letitia Monroe. She was not beautiful in the soft, pastel way that the illustrated ladies' magazines from back east described beauty. She was something more arresting than that. She was tall for a woman of her era, with dark auburn hair she kept pinned severely because she had no time for vanity, and gray eyes that people tended to describe later as having seen right through them. She worked her own land. She drove her own wagon into town every Tuesday for supplies. She paid her debts on time, and she did not ask for charity, and she did not smile at men who did not deserve it, which was, as it turned out, most of them. The promises began almost immediately. The first came from Harlan Dobbs, who owned the general store and who had a wife in poor health and a covetous eye on Letitia's creek-fed acreage. He came to her land in April of 1879 with a jar of honey from his own hives and told her he could make sure her supply orders were always first priority and her prices were always fair if she would consider his friendship. He did not say what kind of friendship, but the implication sat in the air between them like smoke. He promised her access to everything the store carried, promised her no woman alone out here would survive a hard winter without a good man's provisions. She thanked him for the honey and showed him the door. The second came from Sheriff Dale Putnam, a wide, handsome man with a silver badge and a reputation for solving problems with other people's suffering. He came to her in the summer of 1879, when a man named Garrett pressed his cattle across her southern fence line and ruined 3 weeks of carefully tended garden work. Putnam rode out, handled the situation, and then lingered at her porch longer than necessary. He told her a woman alone on that much land was a target. He told her he could ride out regularly, make sure she was safe and secure. He promised her no harm would come to her under his watch. He said it with that warm, slow smile that the women in town found charming, and Letitia understood, with the precision she applied to everything, that what he was actually promising was his own protection racket with a romantic veneer. She thanked him for his help with the cattle and did not invite him to linger. There were others. A rancher named Theo Cross who promised her his water rights in exchange for combining their properties, which would have meant combining their lives. A young lawyer from Albuquerque who rode through on his way to a land dispute case and who promised her he could file papers to expand her claim if she gave him reason to stay. A preacher who held services in the back of the barber shop on Sundays and who promised her that a woman of her character deserved a husband of standing, meaning himself. By 1880, the promises had calcified into a kind of pressure that Letitia felt as a physical weight on her chest every time she drove her wagon into town. She had built something real. She had done it herself. She had planted winter wheat and summer corn, and a kitchen garden that she tended with the same focused attention she had once given to embroidery lessons in her mother's parlor in St. Louis. She had mended her own fences and doctored her own animals and kept careful accounts in a ledger she bought from Harlan Dobbs's store, paying full price, accepting no charity. And all of it was being treated as a bargaining chip by men who believed her independence was a problem requiring their solution. The one person in town who never offered her anything she had not asked for was Augusto Reyes, and she loved him for it the way you love a clean glass of water after a long walk. He was 63 years old, arthritic in both hands, with a vegetable garden that put hers to shame and a knowledge of the land that went back generations. He did not make her promises. He simply showed up when there was work that needed 2 sets of hands and went home when it was done. It was Augusto who first mentioned the trouble that would eventually consume everything. He came to her fence line one morning in late August of 1881 with a look on his face she had not seen before, something carefully controlled, the expression of a man holding a difficult thing with both hands so it would not spill. "There is talk," he said, "about the Vane brothers." Letitia kept her hands moving along the fence post she was reinforcing with wire. "I have heard some of it. Cletus Vane has been telling men at the saloon that your creek is going to be part of his water claim by spring," Augusto said. "He has been saying it like it is already decided." She stopped working. She turned to look at him. On what basis? He has a lawyer in Santa Fe, Augusto said. A man named Fowler who is very good at finding the kinds of errors that were easy to make in the early days of homestead filings. Letitia set down her pliers. The morning light was still cool, the kind of pale gold that did not last past 7 in August, and she could hear her creek running behind the south pasture, clear and constant and entirely hers. What kind of error? She asked. The kind that can be invented, Augusto said carefully, if a man has enough money and needs a creek badly enough. The Vane brothers, Cletus and his younger brother Porter, had arrived in the Caldwell's crossing area in 1880 with a cattle operation that grew faster than honesty usually allowed. They had bought out 2 homesteaders already, both men who had accepted offers that were less about market value and more about the cost of making Cletus Vane stop applying pressure. The brothers were not outright violent, or had not been yet. They were the kind of men who understood that the law was a tool that bent toward whoever held the handle with the most money. Letitia went to Sheriff Putnam about it. He listened to her concerns with that same slow, sympathetic smile and told her these were civil matters, best handled through proper legal channels. He told her that if she ever felt uncertain about her situation, she knew where his office was, and his door was always open. The implication was the same as it had always been. His protection was available, at a price she was not willing to pay. She went to the lawyer in town, a young man named Thomas Hale who was technically competent but who was also deeply afraid of Cletus Vane and whose hands shook when she described the situation. He told her he could look into it. He told her it might take some time. He promised her he would do everything he could. She walked out of his office, understanding that everything he could do was approximately nothing. The autumn of 1881 came and went, and the winter, and when spring of 1882 arrived, a notice appeared on the door of the county land office in Caldwell's Crossing, filed by one Harlan Fowler, attorney, Santa Fe, New Mexico Territory, claiming a survey discrepancy in the original homestead filing of one Letitia Monroe, widow, which discrepancy, if upheld, would require the repositioning of her southern boundary line, removing the creek from her property entirely. It was the kind of legal trap that was elegant in its dishonesty. The filing cited a measurement error in the original survey, and since the original surveyor had died of a heart attack in 1880, there was no one to contradict it with living memory. It would require a counter-survey, filed in Santa Fe, and a hearing before a land commissioner who rode circuit only twice a year. By the time it was resolved, it would be winter again, and by winter, depending on how the summer went with her crops, Letitia's financial reserves would be stretched very thin. Cletus Vane came to her property in April of 1882. He came alone, riding a good gray horse and wearing his Sunday coat, which was his version of dressing for an important occasion. He was 41 years old, broad-shouldered, with a thick dark beard that he kept trimmed and small brown eyes that calculated rather than saw. He was not, by the standards of the time and place, a bad-looking man. He was the kind of man whose appeal was entirely dependent on his not opening his mouth. He took off his hat when she came to the porch, which was the only polite thing he did. "Miss Monroe," he said. He had taken to calling her that rather than Mrs. Monroe, which was his small way of reminding her that widow was a diminished category. "I expect you have seen the filing." "I have," she said. She did not invite him onto the porch. "It is a regrettable situation," he said. He did not sound regretful. These old surveys were done carelessly, and the law has to be upheld even when it causes hardship for individuals. "Is that what you came to tell me?" she asked. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that knew it was winning. "I came to offer a solution," he said. "I am a reasonable man, Letitia. I have always been a fair man to deal with. I would hate to see you spend the summer and the fall fighting a legal battle that is going to be expensive and uncertain, when there is a very simple resolution available to both of us." "Go ahead and say it plainly," she said. "Sell me the south 40 acres and the creek frontage." he said. "I will pay you a fair price. Not market value, because the legal situation changes what market value means, but a fair price. You keep your house and your north acreage and your garden. I get the water access I need. Everybody walks away with something." She looked at him for a long moment. The spring wind was moving through the pinon pines behind the house, and there was a meadowlark calling somewhere in the south pasture, and the creek she could not see was making the small, steady sound it always made. "No," she said. His expression changed. Not dramatically, not with anger yet, just a kind of tightening, a door closing. "I would think carefully before. I have thought carefully," she said. "The answer is no." He put his hat back on. He looked at the house, then the fence line, then back at her. "There are more ways for a woman alone to find herself in a difficult situation than a land dispute," he said. His tone was still conversational, pleasant even. It was the pleasantness that made it a threat. "You might think on that." He rode away, and Letitia stood on her porch and watched him go and felt, for the first time since coming to New Mexico territory, genuinely afraid. Not of Cletus Vane specifically. Of the machinery he represented, the way money and law and male consensus could be arranged around a woman's life like the walls of a room that kept getting smaller. She sat down in her rocking chair after he was gone, the same chair she had carried in the back of her wagon all the way from St. Louis, the chair where she had nursed her sick husband in his final weeks, and she opened her leather journal and wrote for a long time without stopping. When she was done, she read what she had written, and it was not a plan. It was the honest record of a woman who had outrun every trap that was put in front of her so far through sheer precision and refusal, and who was beginning to feel the edges of her own limitations. It was into this situation, in the first week of September 1882, that Timothy Hudson rode into Caldwell's crossing on a bay horse with a cracked hoof that needed a farrier's attention. He was 29 years old, though he looked older in certain lights and younger in others, depending on whether the light found the tiredness in his face or the brightness behind his eyes. He was lean without being thin, with dark hair that wanted cutting and a jaw shadowed with several days' growth of beard. He wore the clothes of a working man, canvas and wool and worn leather, nothing that announced him as anything in particular. He had a Colt single-action Army revolver on his hip that he wore the way experienced men wore sidearms, as a tool rather than a declaration. He paid for the farrier, paid for a room at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Callahan, paid for his meals at the small restaurant next to the post office, and otherwise made no impression on the town of Caldwell's crossing whatsoever. He was a drifter, which in 1882 in New Mexico territory was not an unusual thing to be. The territory was still in the process of deciding what it was going to become, and men without fixed addresses were as common as the red dust that got into everything. Letitia first saw him on the third day of his stay, when she came into town for her weekly supplies, and he was sitting on the bench outside the general store with a cup of coffee, looking at nothing with the focused attention of a man who was actually looking at everything. She did not think much about him. She carried her boxes out of the store to her wagon and drove home, and did not think about the quiet man on the bench again until the following Tuesday. He was still there. Not on the bench, the bay horse was in the corral behind the livery, the cracked hoof apparently a more serious matter than it had first appeared, but in town, present in that quiet way of his. She saw him helping Mrs. Callahan carry a piece of furniture up the stairs of the boarding house. She saw him eating alone at the restaurant with a worn book open beside his plate. She saw him talking to Augusto Reyes, of all people, at the edge of town one morning, the two of them standing beside the road in an easy silence that looked like the silence of men who found words less reliable than presence. It was Augusto who told her about him on the third week. "His name is Timothy Hudson," Augusto said. They were in Letitia's kitchen, and she had made coffee and put out the biscuits she had baked that morning, and outside the afternoon wind was moving the grass in long, slow waves. He was a cattle driver before, worked the Kishom for 3 seasons, then a ranch outside of Amarillo for 2 years. He is not running from anything as far as I can tell." "Why are you telling me about him?" Letitia asked. Augusto wrapped both arthritic hands around his coffee cup. "Because I told him about your situation," he said, "with the land, with Vane." She set down her own cup with more force than she intended. "Augusto." "He asked," Augusto said. "He saw that you looked worried. He asked me if everything was all right with you, and I told him." "I do not need a drifter's sympathy," she said. "No," Augusto agreed. "You are not a woman who needs sympathy. But you might need someone who does not have a stake in the outcome." She thought about that for a long time after he left. The next morning, without having fully decided to, she found herself walking past the restaurant at the hour she knew Timothy Hudson ate breakfast. The door was open to the autumn morning air. He was there, at his usual corner table, the book open beside his coffee. He looked up when she walked past the open doorway, and their eyes met for a brief, clean moment that was entirely unlike the way any other man in this town had ever looked at her, because there was nothing in his expression that wanted anything from her at all. She kept walking. She came back 20 minutes later and sat down at the table across the restaurant from him and ordered coffee and a plate of eggs from the young woman who served the tables. And she ate her breakfast and read the letter she had received from the land commissioner's office, which contained approximately no good news. And she was aware the whole time that Timothy Hudson was there, and that he was not looking at her, and that she found both of these things unreasonably comforting. When she stood to leave, he said, without looking up from his book, "The commissioner in Santa Fe is named George Aldrich. He has overturned 6 fraudulent survey claims in the last 4 years. His address is on file at the land office here." She stopped. She turned around. He was still looking at his book. "Augusto told me the shape of your trouble," he said. "I have spent time in Santa Fe. I know some people. I am not offering anything. I just thought that information might be useful." She looked at him for a moment. The morning light was coming through the restaurant window and lying across the table between them in a warm, indifferent stripe. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, still looking at the book. She left and walked to the land office and got Commissioner Aldrich's address. That was how it began, not with a promise. Not with a man presenting himself as a solution to her problems and requiring something in return. Just a piece of information, given without conditions, taken and used by a woman who knew how to use things. She wrote to Commissioner Aldrich that same afternoon. A careful, precise letter, laying out the facts of the fraudulent filing with the exact kind of language she had learned from reading every legal document that had ever crossed her path, and citing 3 of the precedents she had found in the county land office files on previous survey disputes. She sealed the envelope herself and paid the post office fee herself, and felt the specific satisfaction of a woman who is fighting her own battle on her own terms. She did not speak to Timothy Hudson again for another 10 days, which was not because she was avoiding him, but because she was genuinely occupied with the business of keeping her land running through the last of the harvest. Her winter wheat had come in well, better than the previous year, and she had 3 cords of wood to stack against the north wall of the house before the first hard frost, and her mules needed their hooves checked, and the fence on the east side had 2 posts that were rotting at the ground and needed replacing. She was in the process of wrestling the second replacement post into the ground, alone because Augusto's hands were particularly bad that week, when she heard a horse come off the road onto the track that led to her property. She straightened up with the post driver in her hands and watched. It was Timothy Hudson. He pulled up at the fence line and looked at the work she was doing and said, "I can finish that if you want." "I am managing," she said. "I can see that," he said. He swung down from the bay horse and tied it to the existing fence and picked up the coil of wire without asking further permission and began working on the section she had not gotten to yet. He worked quickly and well, with the efficient movements of someone who had done this kind of work many times. She watched him for a moment, then went back to setting her post. They worked together for an hour without speaking except for the practical words of the work itself, the occasional direction or observation about where the wire needed to be tightened, where the post needed another foot of depth. When they were done, the east fence was solid and true, and the autumn light had shifted from gold to copper, and the air had the particular cold edge that meant frost before morning. She offered him coffee. He tied the horse properly and followed her to the house and sat at the kitchen table while she stoked the stove and put the pot on, and that was the first time they had been in the same room with the ordinary domestic quietness of two people who are comfortable sharing space. "You are staying in Caldwell's Crossing longer than I would have expected," she said. "The horse's hoof needed more time than I thought," he said. "The horse has been fine for a week," she said. He looked at her directly for the first time, and she saw what was behind those eyes, not calculation, not desire in the predatory sense, but something careful and searching, the look of a man who had learned to take his time with things that mattered. "Yes," he said simply. "I know." She put the coffee on the table and sat down across from him. The kitchen was warm and smelled of pine smoke and the dried herbs she hung in bunches from the ceiling beams. The journal sat on the corner of the table where she always left it. "Tell me about yourself," she said. "Not what you have done, who you are." It was not the kind of question most people asked, and he did not seem to have expected it. He was quiet for a moment, the way people are quiet when they are being honest rather than performing. "I am from Ohio originally," he said. "Came west after the war. I was too young for the war itself, which I have always felt both guilty about and grateful for in turns. My family had a farm. I left because I could not be still. I have been moving since I was 18. He paused. "I am not sure anymore whether that is who I am or whether it is a habit I mistook for identity." She considered that. "What made you consider the difference?" He looked at the table between them. "Seeing what it looks like when someone has built something real," he said quietly, "and how much it costs them to defend it." They talked for 2 hours. She had not talked like that with anyone in years, not since Robert, and even with Robert it had been different, lighter. They had both been very young, and the conversations had been about the future in the abstract way that young people plan futures. This was something else. This was two people who had both been tested by their respective lives, comparing notes on what they had learned. He told her about the Kishom Trail, the 3 cattle drives north, the particular combination of boredom and terror that defined that kind of work. He told her about the ranch outside of Amarillo, where he had worked as a foreman for 2 years before the owner sold, and the new buyers brought their own men. He told her he had been moving since then, a year of drifting through the territory, and that he had been in 11 towns in that year, and this was the first one that had felt like something other than a place to pass through. She told him about Robert, about the 14 months of marriage that had been genuinely happy despite their brevity, about the cholera and the grief and the decision to come west alone. She told him about building the house and planting the first crop and the satisfaction that was unlike anything she had felt before, the specific pride of a thing that was entirely hers and entirely the product of her own labor. She told him about the parade of promises, not bitterly but factually, the way you describe weather patterns. "This is the condition here. This is what I have learned to navigate." He listened to all of it without interrupting and without trying to solve it, and when she was done, he said, "You are the most competent person I have met in a long time." "That is not a romantic thing to say," she said, and then was surprised at herself for saying it. He smiled. It was the first real smile she had seen from him, and it changed his face entirely, took 10 years off it, made him look like what he might have been before whatever weight he carried had settled on him. "No," he agreed, "but I mean it as a profound respect. The world has not made it easy for you, and you have not made it easy on yourself either. You have done this by being genuinely good at it." She found, to her irritation and then her amusement, that she was blushing. "You should probably go before it gets fully dark," she said. "The track from here to the road is uneven." He stood and picked up his hat from where he had set it on the chair beside him. At the door, he paused. "Miss Monroe," Letitia. The use of her given name was careful, a question asked rather than a permission assumed. I would like to help you with the legal situation, if you will allow it. Not because I think you cannot handle it, because I have connections in Santa Fe that might be useful, and using them on your behalf would give me something to do with myself other than read the same book twice. She thought about the parade of men who had offered their help and the prices they had attached to it. What would you want in return? She asked. He put his hat on and looked at her levelly. Nothing, he said. That is not how I operate. She studied him for a long moment. The fire in the stove was ticking quietly. The night outside was deep and cold and full of stars. All right, she said. Thank you. He left, and she stood at the window and watched the lamp of his lantern move along the track toward the road and disappear. And then she sat down at the table and opened her journal and wrote for a very long time. What followed was 3 weeks that Letitia would later think of as the time she learned what it felt like to have an ally rather than a creditor. Timothy wrote 2 letters to Santa Fe, one to Commissioner Aldrich and one to a man he knew there, a former marshal named Cole Hastings who had turned to land law after a knee injury took him out of field work. The letters were short and specific and contained no emotional appeals, just facts and legal citations, the language of people who understood that emotion was a distraction in a legal dispute and precision was the weapon. He came to her property 3 more times in those weeks, always with a practical reason. He had found a crack in the stone foundation of her root cellar that would let cold air in, which he showed her, and they repaired together. He had heard from the farrier that one of her mule's front shoes was loose, and offered to ride with her to the livery since the road was particularly muddy, and a lame mule on that stretch was a problem. He was always clear about what he was there for. He did not linger past the practical reason. And then he always did linger because she asked him questions, or because there was coffee made and they both seemed to find the other's company easy in the way that is rarer than most people realize. On the 3rd visit, they sat on her porch in the fading warmth of a mid-September afternoon, and she said, without planning to, "Why have you never made promises to me?" He turned to look at her. The question hung between them. "What do you mean?" he said, though she thought he knew. "Every man who has sat in this vicinity has told me what he could give me, what my life could look like, what I deserved or needed or ought to have," she said. "You have never done that." He was quiet for a moment. "Because those things are not mine to promise," he said. "Your life is already a thing you have built and are building. It is not a shape I could give you. It was not shaped to fit me." He paused. "And because promises are easy, they cost less than what they purchase, and then the gap between the promise and the keeping of it becomes a debt that someone else pays." She looked at him. "And yet you stayed in Caldwell's Crossing." "I stayed," he said. "Why?" He looked at her directly again with that clear, careful gaze. "Because I wanted to see how the story came out," he said, "and because I wanted to be near you." The honesty of it was so clean, so unadorned, that it was several seconds before she understood she was holding her breath. "Timothy," she said, "you do not have to say anything back," he said immediately. "I am not presenting you with a debt. I am just," he stopped, "being honest because I think that is what you deserve, and because I am not good at being otherwise." She looked out at the south pasture, where the grass was going bronze in the September light, and the creek she could not see was making its small, constant sound. "I appreciate that," she said, "more than you know." That evening when he left, she watched his lantern on the track again and felt something she had not let herself feel in a long time. It was not hope exactly. It was more specific than that. It was the feeling of being seen accurately, by someone who was not trying to use what they saw. The letter from Commissioner Aldrich arrived in the first week of October. She read it standing at the post office door, the autumn wind pressing at the back of her neck, and then she read it again more slowly. The commissioner had reviewed the disputed survey and found sufficient grounds to order an independent counter-survey at the county's expense, which would take precedence over the Vane filing. The hearing was set for December. Given the documented irregularities in the Vane attorney's cited measurements, The commissioner indicated in carefully diplomatic legal language that the filing had the characteristics of a manufactured dispute, and that such filings were treated seriously by his office. It was not victory, but it was the solid ground underfoot that she had been standing on the edge of losing, and it was real. She went directly to the boarding house and knocked on the door of Timothy Hudson's room, which she had never done before. He opened the door with his shirt untucked and his boots in his hand and looked at her, and she held up the letter. He took it and read it standing in the doorway, and when he looked up his expression was one she would think about later, the particular expression of a person who is genuinely happy for another person, uncomplicated by self-interest. "Cole came through," he said. "You came through," she said. "You wrote the first letter," he said. "You gave Aldrich the legal framework. We all just reinforced what you already built." She was standing in the narrow hallway of the boarding house, and there was nowhere to look but directly at him, and the letter was between them, and the autumn light was coming through the small window at the end of the hall in a long, pale rectangle. She stepped forward and she kissed him, and it was brief and certain, not the kiss of a woman who was overcome, but the kiss of a woman who had made a decision, which was how Letitia Monroe did everything. He did not move for a moment after, as if checking that it had been real. Then he put one hand against her face, just resting, the lightest possible contact, and looked at her with an expression that was so carefully held she could see how much it was holding. "Letitia," he said. "I know," she said. "I know what I am doing." He kissed her back, and this time it was longer, warmer, and Mrs. Callahan coughed somewhere below them on the stairs, and they broke apart, and Letitia took her letter back and put it in her coat pocket, and straightened her collar, and Timothy Hudson leaned against the doorframe with that smile again, the one that took years off him, and she walked down the stairs feeling more certain of the ground under her feet than she had in a very long time. The certainty lasted 4 days. On the 5th day, Cletus Vane came to town with his brother Porter, and 2 men who worked their ranch, large, quiet men who did what they were told, and he went directly to Thomas Hale, the timid lawyer, and within an hour the word had gone through the town like water through sand. Vane knew about the counter-survey order. He knew about the letter from Commissioner Aldrich. He knew about the letters from Santa Fe, which meant that someone in the land office, the clerk, a young man named Perch who had a wife and a debt to Vane's brother, had been reporting on the incoming and outgoing mail. Letitia heard about it from Augusto, who had heard it from the woman who ran the laundry. She was in the middle of mending a harness in her barn when Augusto came riding up the track, which he rarely did in the middle of the day, and the expression on his face was the careful one again. "Vane is angry," Augusto said. "He knows his filing is going to fail. He has lost money and standing, and he is the kind of man who cannot accept that a woman alone can stand up to him without help. And," she said, because there was clearly an end, "he is saying things at the saloon," Augusto said carefully, "about you and the drifter, about what kind of woman pays a drifter to fight her battles." Letitia set down the harness. The anger came up clean and hot and familiar, the anger she had learned to keep controlled, like a fire in a stove, because in her experience an angry woman was always the problem in a room full of men who had caused the anger. "What is he going to do?" she asked. "I do not know," Augusto said. "But Porter Vane rode out to Hale's office this morning with some papers. I think they are filing something else, some other kind of legal move." She went to find Timothy Hudson and found him at the livery, where he had been helping the farrier with a mare who was difficult to shoe. He listened to what she told him, and his expression did the thing it sometimes did, went very still, which she had learned was not the absence of feeling but the presence of it, being held carefully. "I should go talk to Vane," he said. "No," she said, "absolutely not. If you go talk to him, it confirms his narrative about what this is." He looked at her. "What is his narrative?" "That I am a weak woman who had to import a man to protect her," she said. "If you go to Vane, you are the man who is protecting me. That is what he wants. It gives him a role in this story that he has not earned, and it removes me from the center of my own fight." He was quiet for a moment, working through that. Then he nodded. "What do you want to do?" "I want to go see Hale and find out what they filed," she said. "And then I want to write to Commissioner Aldrich again, directly, and alert him that Vane is attempting a secondary filing, which Aldrich's letter made clear would be viewed as bad faith interference." "Good," Timothy said. "Do that. I will not go near Vane." He kept his word, which she noted. But Vane did not need Timothy to go to him. The following week brought October in earnest, cold mornings and afternoons that still held warmth. The sky, a particular saturated blue that she had learned to love about this land. Vane's secondary filing, it turned out, was not legal at all. It was a claim that Letitia's original homestead application had been filed fraudulently, based on her being a widow rather than a head of household in the legal sense. It was the kind of argument that had occasionally succeeded in the 1870s when the law was less settled, and Hale's hands were shaking when he explained it to her, which she recognized as his way of telling her it was serious without having to say so. She wrote the letter to Aldrich that evening, precise and thorough and furious in its careful legality. She cited 3 federal cases. She cited the 1862 Homestead Act language explicitly. She sealed it and paid the postage herself. 2 days later, Cletus Vane's man Perch, the mail clerk, did not forward the letter to Santa Fe. She did not know this for a week, and when she found out from the postmaster's wife, who was one of those women who knew everything that happened in any public building, the particular cold clarity of understanding a trap after you have already walked partway into it was something she felt in her hands and her stomach simultaneously. Vane had not just filed a false legal claim. He was actively blocking her ability to respond to it, which meant he had people in the Postal Service and the Land Office, which meant the legal system in Caldwell's Crossing was sufficiently in his pocket that her careful, law-abiding response was being intercepted. She went to Timothy that evening. Not because she needed rescuing, she was clear about that, but because she needed to think out loud with someone she trusted. And he had become, without a dramatic announcement of the fact, the person she trusted most in the world. They sat on her porch in the cold of the evening, wrapped in separate coats, close enough that she could feel the warmth from him without touching, and she laid out the situation in its full shape. All the pieces, the original survey dispute, the counter-survey order, the secondary filing, the intercepted letter, Perch the mail clerk, the 2 quiet large men who followed Vane around. When she was done, Timothy said, "He is going to escalate." "I know," she said. "He has gone too far to let this fail quietly," Timothy said. "He has spent money on Fowler the lawyer, he has put his name to false filings, he has corrupted a postal employee. If this comes to light in the way it should, he is looking at serious legal consequences. He cannot let it come to light." "Which means he has to win," she said, "or he has to make it impossible for me to continue fighting." "Yes," Timothy said, "those are his options." They were quiet for a moment. The stars were very clear and close in the October sky, the way they got when the air was cold and dry. "I am not going to sell to him," she said. "I know," he said, "and I am not going to leave." "I know that too." She looked at him. "What are you going to do?" "Whatever you ask me to do," he said. "That is all." She looked at him for a long time in the dark. The fire in the stove inside the house was making the small square of the kitchen window glow orange and warm, and the creak she could hear on cold nights like this one was murmuring in the south pasture, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be, and so, she thought with a certainty that surprised her with its force, was he. "Stay," she said. It was one word, and it meant several things, and he heard all of them. "All right," he said. He did not say anything else about it, and neither did she, and they sat on the porch in the cold for another half an hour before she went inside, and he rode back to town, and she wrote in her journal that night for a long time about what it felt like when a person respected what you asked for without wanting you to explain it further. The next 3 days were a kind of ticking quiet that she had learned to distrust. Vane was not visible, which was not the same as him being absent. She sent a copy of everything, all the filings, the commissioner's letter, a written account of the intercepted mail, by private rider to Santa Fe, paying the rider herself, a young man who worked for the express company and who had no connection to Vane. It cost her more than she should have spent, but precision had a price, and she was willing to pay it. She also wrote a letter to the Albuquerque Journal, detailing the fraudulent survey claim and the mail interference, which she sent with the same rider. She did not know if it would be published. She sent it anyway. On the fourth day, Sheriff Putnam came to see her. He arrived in the middle of the morning in his official capacity, which he announced by riding up in his good coat with his badge polished, and he asked if he could come inside. She let him stand on the porch. "I have received a complaint from Cletus Vane," he said, "that you have been harassing him and his operations with fraudulent counterfilings and malicious letters to the commissioner." She stared at him. "You cannot be serious." "Now, Letitia, I am just doing my job," he said, with that warm smile that she had never found warming. "I am required to follow up on complaints." "He has filed a fraudulent survey claim, corrupted a postal employee, and blocked official correspondence," she said, "and you are here to talk to me about harassment." "Those are accusations," Putnam said. "I have not seen evidence of them." "Then you have not looked," she said, "because the evidence is in the land office, in the postal records, and in the commissioner's own files in Santa Fe." He looked at her with something that was almost pity, which was worse than the smile. "I would strongly encourage you to consider a resolution that does not require so much conflict," he said. "You are one woman alone in a situation that has gotten complicated. A sensible person would." "I want you to leave my property," she said. "Right now." He left, but not before he said one more time that his door was always open. She went inside and sat at the kitchen table and was, for about 4 minutes, deeply afraid. Not of physical harm, of the particular kind of defeat where the machinery is so thoroughly arranged against you that even your victories can be turned into evidence of your wrongdoing. She was afraid of what it felt like to be a woman in 1882 in New Mexico territory, who had done everything right and discovered that right had a ceiling. Then she stood up and went out to the barn and fed her animals and checked her fence line and came back and started cooking for dinner, because fear was not an action and action was what she had. Timothy came that evening with a look on his face she had not seen before, the stillness that was more present than usual, holding more. "Putnam visited you," he said. "Yes," she said. "Word travels." "He is in Vane's pocket," Timothy said. "I should have understood that sooner." "So should I," she said. He sat down. She set a plate in front of him and sat across from him. They ate together in the firelight, the stove crackling, the night outside pressing close and cold. "The rider I sent to Santa Fe," she said. "He should arrive day after tomorrow. If Aldrich acts quickly on what I sent him, Vane's position starts to collapse." 2 days, Timothy said. "Yes," she said. They both knew that 2 days was a long time when a man with a great deal to lose was becoming desperate. She did not know that Vane had been watching the private rider leave town. She did not know that one of his men had ridden ahead on a different road and would intercept the rider before he reached the territorial capital, which was a thing that required force rather than legal maneuvering, and which crossed a line that Vane had perhaps not fully decided he was going to cross until he found himself crossing it. The rider came back the following morning, having been stopped on the road by 2 men, relieved of his documents and his fee, and left with a bruised jaw and a very clear message about what happened to people who carried Letitia Monroe's mail to Santa Fe. He came to her property to tell her himself, because he was frightened, and because she had hired him and he thought she deserved to know. His name was Will Canton. He was 17 years old and working for the express company to save money for a homestead of his own, and he sat in her kitchen with a cold cloth on his jaw and told her what had happened with the directness of someone who has just discovered that the world is more dangerous than they thought. She thanked him and sent him home with an extra $1 for his trouble, which she could not truly afford and gave anyway, and then she went and found Timothy. "He has crossed into assault and robbery," Timothy said when she told him. "This is no longer a civil matter." "No," she agreed. "We need to go to Putnam," he said, and then stopped himself because they both already knew that was useless. "We need to go over Putnam's head," she said, "the territorial marshal's office." "That will take days," Timothy said. "I know," she said, and then, "I also know something else. Vane is running out of controlled options. He cannot keep intercepting my mail indefinitely. He cannot attack a United States Express Company rider without consequences if that rider reports it. He is starting to make mistakes driven by panic, and panicking men do dangerous things." "You should not be at your property alone," Timothy said. "I am not moving," she said. "I know," he said. He paused. "I could stay nearby, not in the house. I would not. I am not suggesting." "I know what you are not suggesting," she said, and felt the warmth of his respect for her reputation as a physical thing. "You can use the barn. There is a cot in the tack room." He nodded. He stayed. That was the night of October 15th, and the night passed quietly, and the morning came cold and clear, and she made coffee for two and brought his cup to the barn and stood in the doorway while the horses moved in their stalls, and he drank the coffee with both hands, and they looked at each other in the early light with the particular clarity of people who have been honest with each other about things that matter. "Timothy," she said. "Yes," he said. "When this is over," she said. "When the legal situation is resolved and Vane has been dealt with and the land is secure." She paused, because she was not a woman who said things she had not fully considered. "I would like to know what you want. Not what you think I need, what you actually want." He was quiet for a long moment. "I want to stop moving," he said. "I want to be somewhere that is mine, not in the sense of ownership," but he stopped. "I want to be somewhere that I have reason to come back to." She looked at him steadily. "That is a want, not a promise," she said. "Yes," he said. "I know the difference." She nodded. She went back inside to start breakfast. Cletus Vane made his move on the morning of October 18th. He came into town earlier than usual, before most people were about, and he sent Porter and the two large men to the post office to intercept any outgoing mail with Letitia's name on it, which was a degree of brazenness that suggested he had decided the careful approach was finished. Then he went to Letitia's property himself. She was in the south pasture when he arrived, close to the creek, checking the fence line that ran along the water because the October rains had softened the ground, and two of the posts had shifted. She heard the horse before she saw him, and she straightened up and turned around, and there was Cletus Vane on his gray horse, and he did not look like a man who had come to negotiate. He dismounted and came through the fence gate, which he did not have permission to open, and walked toward her with the particular purposeful gait of someone who has made a decision and is seeing it through. "You are on my property without invitation," she said. "I think you need to understand something clearly," he said. He was close now, 15 feet, 10 feet, and she held her ground because she was not a woman who stepped back. "This has gone far enough. Whatever you sent to Aldrich, whatever you have filed in Santa Fe, I am going to bury it. I have spent too much on this to let some." He stopped himself before the word he was about to use, perhaps because it was the kind of word that, once out, could not be taken back in front of a woman who had witnesses in a territorial legal dispute. "Some woman alone," he finished, "derail everything I have built. You have built it on my land," she said, "and it is still my land." His hand went to the gun at his hip, and even Letitia Monroe, who was not easily frightened, felt the bottom of her stomach drop. She had not thought he would go this far. She had understood intellectually that desperate men became dangerous men, but there was a difference between understanding a thing intellectually and standing 10 feet from a man whose hand was on a gun. "You are going to sell me the South 40 and the creek," he said. "Today. You are going to write it up and sign it, and this is going to be finished." "No," she said. Her voice was steady and she was proud of it. He drew the gun. He raised it. He pressed it against her temple, and that was when she heard her own voice saying with the clarity of complete conviction, "Every single one of them made me promises." And she looked past Cletus Vane's gun hand and saw Timothy Hudson standing 30 feet away in the main street, because they had walked while they argued, step by slow step, past her fence gate and onto the road at the edge of town, and people had come out of buildings to watch. and Timothy was there, still uncertain as a fence post in hard ground. "Let her go, Vane," he said. And Cletus Vane, whose hand was shaking, said everything would be fine if she would just cooperate. And Timothy took one step and then another and said he had nothing to lose, and said he had made one promise to Letitia Monroe and intended to keep it. Vane's hand was trembling now with genuine violence. He had not planned to actually use the gun. Letitia could feel, in the tension of his arm against her hair, that this was a man who had terrified people with implied force for so long that the reality of deployed force was something he had not fully imagined. His strength was in systems and money and legal pressure. He was not, underneath it, a physically brave man. "What promise?" Vane said, and his voice cracked slightly on the word. "What promise did a drifter with nothing make to a woman who has nothing?" "That she would keep her land," Timothy said. He was 20 feet away now, still not reaching for his gun, still with his thumbs in his pockets, looking at Vane with an expression of absolute calm that was more threatening than fury. "I told her, no matter how this goes, she will keep her land. That is the promise. One promise, and I am going to keep it." There was a sound from the edge of the crowd, and then another sound, the distinctive jangle of harness and the thud of boots on packed dirt, and into the street rode 3 men, unfamiliar faces, riding horses with the United States Territorial Marshal's insignia on their saddlebags. Letitia would later learn that her letter, the one she had sent before Vane's men intercepted the express rider, the earlier one, the one that had actually gone through before the mail clerk was turned, had arrived in Santa Fe and been escalated by Commissioner Aldrich to the Territorial Marshal's office. And that the marshal, a man named George Tarrant who had no relationship with Cletus Vane and no reason to protect him, had moved faster than anyone had expected. The lead marshal pulled up his horse in the street and said, in a voice that carried the flat authority of a man used to being the loudest thing in a difficult room, "Cletus Vane, put down that weapon." Vane's arm dropped. He took the gun from Letitia's temple with the mechanical movement of a man whose script has just been torn away. She stepped back and away from him without looking at him, walked 3 deliberate steps, and then turned to face him, because she was not going to let this moment have her back to it. The marshal's deputies were already dismounting. One of them had handcuffs out, the steel kind that the territorial office had started using that year, and Cletus Vane looked at them with the expression of a man watching something he had built collapse, which it was. Letitia walked toward Timothy, and he walked toward her, and they met in the middle of the street while behind them, the marshals put cuffs on Cletus Vane and took Porter Vane's gun, and the crowd of Caldwells crossing watched with the fascinated horror and relief of people who have been waiting a long time for a particular thing to end. Timothy put both hands on her shoulders and looked at her face with that searching, careful gaze. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "I never drew my gun," he said, as if still slightly surprised by it. "You did not need to," she said. He pulled her into him, and she let herself be held for a moment, both arms inside his coat, her face against his shoulder, and the October sun was warm on her back, and the creek she could not see from here, but had never been very far from, was running clear in the south pasture, and she was precisely where she was supposed to be. The days that followed were busy with the necessary details of resolution. Marshal Tarrant and his deputies were thorough and took their work seriously. They interviewed Letitia, then Timothy, then Augusto, then Will Canton the express rider, then the postmaster's wife, then Harlan Dobbs, who turned out to know more than he had previously admitted because he was afraid of Vane and was now more afraid of the territorial marshal. They examined the land office records and found the clerk Perch's tampering, which was meticulous and damning. They took statements about the fraudulent survey filing and the secondary filing, and sent an express rider, their own, with a marshal's escort to Santa Fe with a comprehensive report. Cletus and Porter Vane were held in the county jail. The lawyer Fowler in Santa Fe was contacted by the commissioner's office. Perch, the male clerk, was dismissed and faced his own legal proceedings. Sheriff Putnam was suspended pending an investigation into his relationship with Cletus Vane's operations, and a deputy from the territorial office ran the sheriff's functions in Caldwell's crossing for the winter. The hearing before Commissioner Aldrich happened in December, as scheduled, in Santa Fe, and Letitia traveled there herself, riding the stagecoach south with her documents in a leather case and Timothy beside her, neither of them feeling the need to fill the long, dusty miles with unnecessary words. The hearing lasted 2 days. Letitia presented her case herself, assisted by a Santa Fe attorney named Gold, who had been recommended by Commissioner Aldrich, and whose confidence in the case was brisk and professional. Timothy testified about the letters he had sent and the connections he had used. Cole Hastings, the former marshal turned land lawyer, testified about the documented irregularities in the Vane filing, and Commissioner Aldrich, who was a small, precise man with reading spectacles and a reputation for no-nonsense decisions, ruled in Letitia Monroe's favor on both the original survey dispute and the secondary fraudulent filing. Her 160 acres were confirmed and secure. The creek was hers. The South 40 was hers. The house and the north acreage and the kitchen garden were hers. All of it, every foot of it, entirely and legally and permanently hers. She stood outside the commissioner's office on a cold December afternoon in Santa Fe with the ruling documents in her leather case and the winter sky above her, the particular pale gray that meant snow before dark, and she felt something release in her chest that she had not even known was held. Timothy stood beside her. He did not say anything because he had an instinct for when silence was the correct response to a large feeling. After a moment she said, "I want to go home." "Yes," he said. They took the stagecoach back the following morning. It was 3 days of travel, uncomfortable and cold, and they arrived in Caldwell's crossing on a Thursday evening in mid-December, with 6 inches of new snow on the ground, and the town looking smaller and more manageable than it had been in the worst weeks of autumn. Augusto met them at the stage stop, wrapped in a heavy wool coat, with a lantern and his mule and a face that showed everything he felt without words, the relief, the pride, the uncomplicated love of an old man for a young woman he had watched become someone extraordinary. "It is settled?" he asked. "It is settled," she said. He embraced her once briefly with both arthritic hands holding her shoulders, and then he looked at Timothy with the level eyes of a man who has been watching something grow from a distance and has decided what he thinks about it. "You staying?" he said. "If I am asked to," Timothy said. Augusto looked at Letitia. "Come to dinner Sunday," she said to Augusto. "Bring an appetite. I am cooking properly." He nodded, satisfied, and climbed back onto his mule and rode home, and the town was quiet around them in the snow, and Letitia looked at Timothy in the lamplight of the stage office and said, "Come help me get my place ready for winter. The south fence will need reinforcing after this snow." "Now," he said, with a slight lift at the corner of his mouth. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tonight I am going to sleep in my own bed for the first time in 3 weeks, and I intend to be unconscious by 8 o'clock. He laughed, genuinely, the full, unguarded laugh of someone who has not laughed in a while, and it made the cold street feel warmer. In the weeks that followed, with Caldwell's crossing settling into the deep quiet of a New Mexico territory winter, Letitia and Timothy found a rhythm together that was unhurried and entirely theirs. He did not move into the house. That was not how things were done in 1882 in a small town, and Letitia was not interested in giving anyone reason to speak of her differently than they already did. But he came every day, usually by mid-morning, and they worked the property together through the winter tasks, checking the root cellar stores, reinforcing the fences that the snow had damaged, keeping the animals warm and healthy, splitting the additional wood she had not had time to finish in autumn. In the evenings, when the early dark of December came down hard, he would stay for dinner, and they would sit by the fire afterward, and she would read or write in her journal, and he would read his worn book, which turned out to be a collection of essays by someone she had not heard of, and they would talk when there was something to say and be quiet when there was not. And she came to understand that this was the thing she had been missing all along, not protection, not promises, but the presence of a person who did not demand anything from her. She came to know him in the way that slow knowledge accumulates. She learned that he had a history of leaving, not because he was a coward, but because he had never found a thing worth the risk of staying for. She learned that his family in Ohio had been hard people in the way that the 19th century made many people hard, not cruel but pressed thin by poverty and expectation, and that he had left at 18 because the only alternative was to spend his whole life being someone else's idea of who he should be. She learned that he had been in love once before, briefly, in Abilene, Kansas, with a schoolteacher who had ultimately married a local banker for the security of it, and that he bore her no ill will and himself no bitterness, just the clean kind of loss that teaches you something true about what you need. He learned her in return. He learned the specific way she set her jaw when she was afraid and not going to say so. He learned that she talked to her mules in complete sentences and was slightly embarrassed about it. He learned that her journal was the place where she was entirely herself, and that she did not show it to anyone, and he never asked her to. He learned that she had loved Robert Monroe deeply and truly in their brief 14 months, and that she did not need that chapter of her life to be diminished or competed with, and he did not attempt either. In January, on a Sunday when Augusto was there for dinner, and the three of them had eaten the venison stew she made with the dried herbs from her garden and the good bread she had recently become proud of, Timothy reached across the table and covered her hand with his and said, in front of Augusto, who was watching with the benign satisfaction of someone who has been patient for a very long time, "I would like to ask you something." She looked at him. "Ask," she said. "I would like to stay here in Caldwell's Crossing," he said. "I would like to build something, a life that belongs somewhere, and I would like to know if you would consider building that alongside me." He paused. "Not a promise of what it will look like, just a question about whether you would be willing." Augusto was looking at his stew with elaborate concentration. She looked at Timothy and thought about the chain of men who had told her what her life would look like, who had described futures they had already decided on and presented them as offers. She thought about this man who had come into her story without announcement and made exactly one promise in the course of 6 weeks, kept it, and was now asking a question instead of delivering an answer. "I would be willing," she said. Augusto's expression, when she glanced at him, was the single most satisfied human face she had ever seen. They were married in the first week of March 1883, when the worst of winter had released, and the first thin green was coming up through the soil in the kitchen garden, in a small ceremony in the parlor of the church that had recently acquired an actual building in Caldwell's Crossing. The minister was a man named Holt, who was nothing like the barbershop preacher of earlier years, a straightforward, decent man who had arrived in town the previous autumn and who had no stake in anyone's land claims. Augusto stood with them. Mrs. Callahan from the boarding house came, and the postmaster's wife, and Will Canton, the express rider who had grown considerably in Letitia's estimation since the day he came to tell her about the men on the road, and a few other women from town who had watched the whole autumn's drama from a respectful distance, and who came now with quiet goodwill and practical gifts: a good wool blanket, a jar of put-up peaches, seeds from a particularly good strain of kitchen garden tomato. Letitia wore her best dress, which was a dark blue wool that she had made herself and which she thought she looked well in. Timothy wore a clean shirt and a coat that was not the duster, a good dark wool coat that Mrs. Callahan had helped him obtain from the general store. He looked in it like a man who had decided to be somewhere. When Reverend Holt asked if they had words for each other, Timothy looked at her and said, "I promised you one thing, and I kept it. I intend to spend the rest of my life keeping the things I say to you, not because promises are easy, but because you have shown me what it looks like when they matter." She had prepared nothing because she was not a woman who prepared speeches, and she looked at him and said, "You are the only person who has ever asked me what I wanted instead of telling me. I want this. I want you. That is all." Reverend Holt pronounced them husband and wife, and Augusto cried without apology, and Will Canton looked at his boots with great interest, and Mrs. Callahan produced a cake from somewhere in the vicinity of her large coat that she had clearly carried to church as a surprise, which it was, and they ate cake in the March sunshine outside the church door, and it was exactly the right kind of wedding for exactly the kind of people they were. Spring came in properly in April, and with it came the business of the new season. Cletus Vane and his brother Porter were tried in Santa Fe in February and convicted on charges including assault, conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of official correspondence, and interference with a federal land process. The attorney Fowler lost his license to practice. The sheriff's position in Caldwell's Crossing was made permanent for a new man, a younger deputy from Las Cruces named Ramirez who had no relationship with the old power structures in town. Harlan Dobbs at the general store, perhaps chastened by how close he had come to a corruption inquiry himself, began treating Letitia Monroe, now Letitia Hudson, with a straightforward commercial respect that was entirely different from his previous manner, and which she appreciated without comment. Timothy found work with the new sheriff's office as a deputy. It suited him in a way that surprised people who had written him off as a drifter with no long-term intentions. He was good at it, steady and perceptive and slow to anger, which were exactly the qualities the job needed in a town that had recently been reminded of what happened when law enforcement had no integrity. He carried the badge without the swagger, and people learned quickly that he meant what he said and said what he meant, which in a badge was a rarer quality than it should have been. The land flourished. Letitia's winter wheat had come through the season well, and the spring planting was the best she had done, partly because she now had a second pair of hands that were reliable and partly because the resolution of the legal situation had returned to her the full focus she had been spending on survival and could now return to growth. She expanded the kitchen garden. She planted a small orchard, 6 apple trees and 4 peach trees along the eastern edge of the property, which would not produce for several years, but which she planted with the long view that had always characterized her approach to the land. Augusto came to dinner every Sunday without exception, and sat with them in the warmth of the kitchen, and told them things he knew about the land and the weather and the plants, and the history of this territory that went back before American settlement, before Spanish settlement, knowledge that was old and precise, and that Letitia wrote down in her journal and remembered. In the early autumn of 1883, on a morning when the light was doing that particular thing it did in September, going from gold to copper in the space of an hour, Letitia told Timothy over the breakfast table that she thought there was a baby coming. He set down his coffee cup very carefully, with both hands, the way he did when he was holding something large. Then he looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, one that she would spend the rest of her life being grateful she had been there to see, complete and unhidden joy, the face of a man who had not allowed himself to expect good things and was suddenly receiving one. "When?" he said. "I think the spring," she said. "I will know better in another month." He stood up from the table and came around it, and she stood, and he held her face in both hands and looked at her with that expression still on him, open and full, and said, "I am very happy." "So am I," she said. Their son was born in April of 1884, a noisy, red-faced, determined boy whom they named James Robert Hudson, the Robert for Letitia's first husband, which Timothy had suggested himself, because he was a man who understood that the honoring of what had come before did not diminish what was present. Augusto held the baby at the age of 66 with his arthritic hands very careful and his face doing everything all at once, and called him a very fine person, which James Robert seemed to accept as his due, being a confident baby from the start. The following spring brought another addition to the property. Timothy had been setting aside money from his deputy's pay for 2 years, and in March of 1885 he came to Letitia with a plan he had drawn up on a piece of paper, careful and measured, for a proper addition to the house. A second room on the north side that would give them more space as James grew, and a proper covered porch along the full front of the house, the kind she had always described wanting when she talked about what Robert had promised her before his death. "You remembered that," she said, looking at the drawing. "I remember everything you tell me," he said. They built it that spring together, with help from Augusto and 2 men from town who were good carpenters, and when it was done, the porch ran the full width of the house front, with 2 rocking chairs on it, and a view of the south pasture and the line of piñon pines in the distant dark shape of the Black Range. And in the evenings they sat there as the sun went down and watched the light change on the land, which was theirs, jointly now, though the deed had always been hers and they had kept it that way. James took his first steps on that porch, on a June evening in 1885, toddling from Timothy's hands to Letitia's with the expression of a person who has just discovered something essential about the nature of the world. In the winter of 1886, Letitia was expecting again, which she announced at Sunday dinner with Augusto by setting a second small plate at the table and looking at both of them until they understood. Augusto laughed out loud, which he did rarely and beautifully, and Timothy looked at her across the table with that open, unguarded expression she had first seen in a Santa Fe hearing room and had been seeing ever since. "We will need to think about the schooling situation," she said practically, after the initial joy had settled. "There is a school in town now, but it is only Tuesdays and Thursdays." "I can teach," Timothy said. "You can teach." "I can read," he said with the dry humor she had come to love. "I can do arithmetic, and I know a great deal about cattle, which has limited educational application but is something." "Your mother taught school," she remembered. He had told her that once in passing. "She did," he said, "in Ohio, before she married my father and the hard years started." He paused. "I used to sit in her classroom in the evenings and read through all the books she kept on the shelf." Letitia looked at him and saw, as she occasionally did, the boy he had been, sitting in the evening light of an Ohio schoolroom reading books that were not his while the world outside was preparing its difficulties. She felt the full weight of everything that had brought both of them to this kitchen, this table, this life, and was grateful for all of it, the grief and the difficulty and the long years and the very specific convergence of events that had put a drifter with a cracked-hoofed horse in a New Mexico Territory town in September 1882. Their daughter arrived in June of 1887, a quietly determined girl with Letitia's gray eyes and Timothy's patience, whom they named Clara Augusto Hudson, the Augusto because the old man was deeply moved by it, and because he deserved to be honored, and because his name in a girl was something neither traditional nor expected, and Letitia had always appreciated both qualities. Augusto held Clara with the same careful arthritic hands and called her the finest person he had ever met, which James, at 3 years old, took somewhat personally before being offered a piece of cake, which resolved the issue. The years that followed built themselves with the specific quality that good years have, not without difficulty, because the land and the weather and the nature of frontier life were never without difficulty, but with the foundation solid under them. There were dry summers and hard winters, and one year when the cattle got a sickness that went through the territory, and they lost 2 of the animals they had acquired over the years. There were disagreements, because Letitia Monroe had strong opinions and Timothy Hudson had strong opinions, and they were both too honest to pretend otherwise. But the disagreements were the kind that 2 people who respect each other can have, arguments with no cruelty in them, ending in the specific satisfaction of 2 people who have argued their way to a better answer than either started with. Timothy became the full sheriff of Caldwell's Crossing in 1889, when Ramirez moved on to a position in Albuquerque, and the town voted for a replacement. He was not a man who sought power, which was precisely why the town trusted him with it. He held the position for 6 years, during which time Caldwell's Crossing grew from a rough frontier settlement into a proper small town with a school and a bank and a doctor, and a newspaper that published every other week. Letitia contributed to that newspaper. She had always written, and when the editor, a young woman who had come from Denver with a press and a determination, asked for contributors who knew the history and the land, Letitia wrote a series of pieces about frontier homesteading, about water rights and land law, and the particular challenges facing women who held property in the territory, that were widely reprinted, and that caught the attention of the woman suffrage movement, which was building in the Western territories through the 1890s with more success than in the East, because frontier women had been doing the work too long to be told they had no voice. She was not a woman who marched or made speeches. She was a woman who wrote precisely about things that were true. And in 1893, when New Mexico Territory was considering its path toward statehood, her pieces were cited in the Territorial Assembly in an argument for women's property rights protections. She read about it in the Albuquerque Journal, sitting at her kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with her coffee, and felt something that was larger than pride but quieter, the satisfaction of something she had built with words having a structure that would stand. Auguste Reyes died in the winter of 1891, at the age of 72, in his own home, in his own bed, with his hands folded on his chest, which is exactly how he would have chosen it. He left his property to Letitia in his will, not because he had no family. He had a daughter in El Paso who had the first option and who declined it gracefully, recognizing that the land meant more to her than it did to her. But because he said in the will, in the careful Spanish-inflected legal English he had taught himself, that there was no one he trusted more to take care of the land and to remember what it had meant. James and Clara and Timothy stood with Letitia at Augusto's grave on the hillside behind his house, which they had dug themselves in the frozen ground of February, and Letitia spoke at the grave in the direct, honest way she spoke about everything that mattered, and said that Augusto Reyes was the best man she had known in her life, which she said with Timothy standing right beside her, and Timothy nodded because he knew it was true and honored it rather than competing with it. They took care of Augusto's vegetable garden that spring, all of them together, Letitia directing and James and Clara working and Timothy doing the heavy digging, and the garden came up better than it had in Augusto's last 2 declining years, which they chose to believe he would have found satisfying. In the spring of 1893, their third child arrived, a boy they named David, who from the very beginning had the particular quality of a person who finds the world endlessly interesting, who would grow up to be a schoolteacher in Las Cruces and a man who wrote letters home every week without fail. James, by his teenage years, had the land in him the way Letitia did, the specific love of dirt and growth and the season's logic, and at 16 he was already talking about expanding the wheat acreage and experimenting with a new grain variety he had read about in the Agricultural Journal, the school now subscribed to. Clara, at 10, had Timothy's stillness and Letitia's precision, and was the kind of child who observed more than she spoke and understood more than she observed, and who would later become a doctor, one of the first women to do so in New Mexico, because her parents had raised her to believe that what she was capable of was the only limitation that had any validity. The rocking chair on the porch that Letitia had carried in her wagon from St. Louis sat on the new porch beside a matching chair that Timothy had built himself, learning to do it properly over 2 weekends with a book on joinery, and the stubbornness that was one of the qualities she loved most about him. They sat in those chairs in the evenings, in the particular quiet of a life that had become what it was supposed to be, and watched the light go down over the south pasture and the line of pinon pines and the distant mountains. On an evening in October of 1895, the same month of year that everything had broken open 13 years before, Letitia sat in her chair with a grandchild in her lap, the daughter of her cousin who had come to stay for the winter, a small red-faced creature of approximately 4 months who had none of the dignity expected of a person with a grandmotherly lap, and expressed this freely. And Timothy sat in his chair beside her with his coffee and said, out of nowhere, in the way he sometimes said things that had been sitting in him for a while, "I used to think staying still was a kind of death." She looked at him. "And now I think it was what I was moving toward," he said. "The whole time, not staying still, coming home." She looked out at the land in the last of the day's light, the gold going to copper the way it always did in October, the creek she could hear but not see from the porch making its small, steady sound in the south pasture, the apple trees she had planted in 1883 standing solid and producing well, the winter wheat already in the ground for next season, the house solid at her back with the good smell of dinner coming through the open window. She thought about every man who had told her what her life would look like. She thought about the promises, all of them, the honey and the badges and the legal maneuvers and the gun. She thought about the morning she had walked past the restaurant window and seen a man reading a book who looked up and wanted nothing from her. She thought about one sentence: "No matter how this goes, she will keep her land." One promise, small, specific, given without performance, kept entirely. "Timothy," she said. He said, watching the mountains. "I love you," she said. It was not a thing she said carelessly or constantly because she was not a careless or constant person. She said it when she meant it most precisely. He turned and looked at her, that open, unhidden expression, the one she had been seeing for 13 years and that had never become ordinary, and said, "I know. And I love you, the real kind, the kind that is still here after the hard years." The baby in her lap made a sound of mild objection to not being the center of attention, which they both acknowledged with the shared amusement of people who find the world genuinely funny. The October light moved across the south pasture in the long, slow way it had. The creek ran on. The apple trees stood in the early dusk. The land was exactly what it had always been: red clay and grama grass and pinon pine, and the particular kind of freedom that you could not find in a city, that her first husband had imagined and she had come here and built, hers, entirely hers, and now in the way that the best things are, entirely theirs. The drifter who had made one small promise stayed for the rest of his life. And every morning for the rest of his life, he woke up in the house that she had built and looked out the window at the south pasture and the distant mountains, and he was precisely where he was supposed to be, and so was she, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, it was everything.